Tdarr, or do I mean Tdarr? Either way, what we're going to do is cover off today an encoding solution for your home media needs. Now, I did have a viewer of mine reach out and actually ask me to do this video, so I thought I'd oblige and we'd kind of cover this off. Now, full disclaimer, when I first done this, I was using Unraid. I have since moved away from Unraid, and that will be a latter video. And I'm now fully back in the whole open world source of TrueNAS. So some of this may be a little bit topical, and you may not also have the full level of consistency across my attire on certain parts of this video. So I do apologize. Now, the reason is that I'm using Tdarr is basically to take my home media that I've legally obtained, or my YouTube videos that I create myself, and compress them down into a different format. Now, most people have been used to doing this with H.265. I'm going to do it with AV1, and I'm going to be using an Intel an A380 card to do that. So let's just take a look at what Tdarr is actually doing for me at the moment, and it's already doing several transcodes at once. So basically, in the background, it is running with the following: at least 4 of my legally attained movies that are actually currently transcoding and reducing the file size dramatically. And I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. If I take this one, for example, which is just a bit of an indication at this stage because it's not fully complete, we are taking a file, bear in mind this is a 4K video file from a total of 62.42 gigabytes. So what Tdarr is currently recommending will actually reduce the size to 14. Now, I'll be honest, I have absolutely upscaled a lot of these settings to really increase the quality when I'm doing this AV1 encoding. You will certainly get better results and even more shrinkage if you leave the default settings. I've just adjusted the quality profile to suit my particular needs. I've got a lot of storage. I'm not too worried about reducing too much, but where I can, I might as well strip down some of this. So let's take a look how we would actually deploy this just using a Ubuntu VM or, LXC container, or even just any kind of Docker image that you're looking to use. Now, I've personally used an Ubuntu server. What I'm going to do on here is basically just show you the Docker Compose file. I'm sure by now a lot of you are very familiar with how to configure Docker Compose files. A lot of this information can also be found from Tdarr's website, so you can absolutely pull some of this up quite seamlessly. Now, for mine, all I've done is basically set a version. It's pretty much obsolete that now anyway, so you don't really need to worry about it too much. Now, mine is set to basically run the internal node as true. You don't have to do this. You can run a separate node, and I'll talk about that a little bit later when I get on to the Unraid version of this. But basically all I'm doing here is setting the current port. So you've got your web URI, your server port, the time zone in there. Now I'm adding the ID, so my user ID and the group ID. This is needed definitely for permissions later. Server IP, if you leave as blank, we'll just use the host. And then obviously just specifying the web UI port. Now this one here is the one you can absolutely change, so feel free if you need to adapt the internal node to true or false. Now if you make it false, basically you'll have to spin up a separate node, and then you'll have to configure this slightly differently. At the bottom here, what I'm using is my two the mappings to what I'm particularly using. Now, because I use Ubuntu as my username, I've basically set up or made a directory for Tdarr to sit in, where basically all the config files and logs are going in there. And then these bottom two here are the main 2 drive mappings for this particular one. Now, if you're doing all this local, you don't need to worry about adding something to your FS tab or basically setting up a mount. Mine are basically mounted, like I said, on my Unraid server. This is on a Proxmox VM, so it sits in a very different area. But what I've actually done is just basically set up a automatic mapping so I can map to these 2. And again, you can see how that's done. So I've made a directory called in mount called media, and one called Tdarr that sits there. So both of those are referenced. Now, the very bottom here, you will notice I've set up the driver bit. Now, this Second bit isn't needed, so I could absolutely delete it down to there and that would work. But basically all I'm doing is referencing the particular device that I need to use in here, and I'll show you how to find that one out. This is very key. Let's just exit out of that. Now I can absolutely just use this now and it will go and spin up and basically build my Tdarr service for me. So I'm going to just exit out. Now to find the device that you're particularly looking for, that's done just using some simple commands. To get that basically we need to set up pass-through. You will need to use a very recent version of Debian just to make sure it's pulling through the kernel drivers for this particular setup, because what we want to be able to do is make sure that we can pull that through. Now if you want to know a little bit about pass-through, you can watch the video above and that will talk you through how to set up pass-through. It is particularly no different for the likes of an Intel device to what it is of a NVIDIA, etc. So you don't necessarily need to do anything particularly clever to kind of pass it through. And to be honest, pass through in Proxmox since version 8 has got a lot simpler than previously. So I'm just going to paste the following command in there. So what I'm basically doing is doing a list of all those device drivers. And at the bottom there, I can see that I've got a render. So the render there is what I'm looking for. There are 2 cards listed. Now, the reason I've got 2 cards is because you think about it, this is an Intel processor, so it does have an iGPU. So that's just what it's finding at the very top there. But the second card is basically the only one that I've enabled because I've not passed through the internal GPU on this, the actual internal quick sync for this. I've just passed through this one. So basically all I'm looking for is that render 128. Once fully spun up, what we'll end up with is pretty much this page. You'll be presented with your first Tdarr. It will take you through a guide, so you've got the option to basically get a bit of a tour around how the system works. But what we're going to do is basically set up some configuration steps. So what I would do is, dependent upon the GPU you've got, and I will share the link to the guide that I'm using to actually use this. So a guy has particularly put together a really good script to basically take all your videos and basically put them through an AV1 script, which is a nice little flow. But basically there's some recommendations in there about the particular GPU you're using. Now this is a separate node that I've configured. This is using an A310. So what I've done in this one, for example, is looking on the main page, I have set the GPU to 2. So it's using 2 consistent streams, and the health check from the CPU to 2 as well. Now I could absolutely spin this up to something like 3, but at the moment I just want to use it in this manner. Now, one of the other things we'll need to do is basically make sure that we auto accept successful transcodes. So we want them to be able to go in there. And from a schedule perspective, what we want to do is really focus on the queue from the largest and then enable those bumped files to actually appear. At the very bottom here, we've got our options with, so you can see what's going on with the queue. I can see that I've got none in the current queue. There's some successful ones there, not required. So these are ones I've done previously. Some transcode errors, so these are the ones I've either cancelled or have some particular error, and then a bit of job history as well. So you can see that currently on this one, 269 files have been through there, so it's just something to be aware of. Now, how I would go about configuring this is also clicking in options, and you'll see that this one has a particular library setup, which is looking at movies. And then what it's doing is it's enabling that GPU worker to do the CPU task. That's something that we need to enable. And you can play around with stuff in here as well. So like the node schedule, like I mentioned earlier, what I could do is absolutely use this at certain times at night. So let's say, for example, I'm on a tariff where I have peak and non-peak hours. I could absolutely just get the transcodes to actually start doing it at that time. But also, if you think about it from something from your personal media perspective, you don't necessarily want it trying to transcode that particular file while you're watching it. So what you can do is set these off to go at different times where you're not less likely to be watching your media, whether it's on Plex or Jellyfin. So I can absolutely just go in here and set when I want that schedule to actually run. So that's just something to be aware of. What I can also do is within libraries is configure those particular libraries. So this is something you definitely need to do. So in each one of these, you will create a separate library. What I've done at the moment is I've just created one for movies. You'd absolutely create one for your TV shows. If you were using this to basically compress personal files as well, you could do it that way to basically, you know, take your YouTube videos and compress them into AV1 format, but just get it to have somewhere that it's constantly watching for. So all I'm doing is turning on folder watch, making sure the process library, and then scan on start as well. So the very first time this spins up, it will absolutely do that scan. Now all I'd be doing here is basically using the browser to again mount to that particular mount that I set up previously, which if you can remember was mount media. So it goes in there. And all I'm doing is basically setting to run an initial scan to find new at the very first time. You don't have to do this, it's just something that's worth doing. Now what I'm doing with the transcode cache, again, is linking that to the particular one. Now on my Unraid server, you'll notice it's called something very different, but on this one, basically the mount path that I've given it is called Tdarr cache. So basically that's linking to that same cache folder that's also hosted in Unraid. And basically it's just a share that's SMB credential orientated, and I can absolutely just run it in there. Now the other options that I need to basically go through is add a filter. So you'll see that there's a filter at scan level and it's looking for those particular ones. But also what I want to be able to do is skip anything that's already encoded in AV1, because let's be honest, I'm not going to re-encode something that's already been encoded that way. So just something to make sure that you've done. Now what I would do at this point, when everything's configured, and I haven't shown you the script yet, but basically what you would do at this point, once everything's set up, you could then do scan find new, and it will go and grab all of those. What you might want to do though is just also apply this schedule. So this is the easier way of doing it. Now the other one that I showed you was basically down to the amount of cores it would use. So what you could do is basically throttle that back a little bit. The guide that I will link in the description has some really, really useful scripts that can be used that basically will look at stuff like Tdarr, which is a really good plugin that sits alongside Plex. And what it can do is if you're running any streams, and let's say I was using the iGPU for example, what it will be able to do is basically take the current playing element, and if something's current playing, it will stop transcodes, and the very moment that your Plex media stops playing, it will then restart transcoding. So it's a really good way to make sure you're not completely throttling all of that options for transcode and those kind of media encoders, either on your iGPU or on your graphics card that you're using. So really, really powerful way of doing it. But let's talk about the flow, because this is what the absolute magic is done in. So now, like I said, I've not developed this flow. The guy has basically published this on GitHub. It's a really, really powerful flow. Basically, if we step through, I will have to zoom in quite a bit, I imagine, on this. But you can see basically how it's starting. So it's looking at that kind of input file, doing some video codec checks. Then basically, if it meets certain criteria, it's just setting that original file and moving off. It's doing stuff like removing images, so this prevents failure. So I think this is basically if something is attached to it. So if there's an image attached to that file, it basically removes it. It then basically looks and starts the FMMPEG command, which is basically what it's using to transcode throughout this. Now you'll see there are different profiles set up here. There is a 4080p, so if you think pre-standard definition really. That is standard definition. And then we've got the HD ones, so the 720 and the 1080p versions of HD. And then finally 4K-ish. I like the way it says ish, but basically it's looking for certain variables. Now you can go in and edit these, and one of the things I've changed, I'll just double click on this, is this value here. So this is the QF. And this is basically to do with the quality format. Now, the lower this number, the higher the quality, but the larger the file size. Now, I think this defaults to something like 30. I've set this to 20. You can set it however you like. To be honest, like I said, I wasn't massively looking for a huge compression, but enough of a compression that actually has some benefits. Now, if you look at the video file I shared earlier, I was reducing it still by 1/7 roughly of the actual original file size. So that's still quite impressive when you think of it in the grand scheme of things. So you can go in and absolutely change those. You can look through the rest of the flow to see what it's doing. It's basically adding some arguments in here. It's basically adding notifies in here. You've got a fail flow, so if there's any fails, it will basically pull all those up. It's got the option to replace the original file because that's what you want it to do. So basically what will happen is once this transcode is successful, it will completely basically transcode that and move that file away, but it'll also replace it as well because that's what you want it to do. And then there's a couple of options to notify TV and notify movies. So it's basically making your server aware, whether it's Jellyfin, whether it's Plex, that those files have changed, which is really, really key. So how do you actually insert this? Great question. How this works is basically it is a code that's put together. So or a script that's put together. We just back out and go into flows. All I need to do is basically click the flow plus. So basically to add a new flow. And you'll see at the very bottom here, there's the option to import the JSON. So what I'm going to do on this particular one is I'll just grab the particular guide that I'm using. I'll open it up on this page so you can see. And then we'll go a bit further down or further up where we're looking for the particular thing. So this is a wonderful guide, very, very informative. This is basically roughly what I'm talking you through now with just a few little tweaks. But the beauty of this is that there is already this, the flow put together to go off and deliver this. So basically the JSON script sits here. He does constantly evolve this as well. So one thing that this particular guy is doing is basically updating this quite regularly. Now to add this and input this into the system, all I need to do is open this up, copy the raw file, go back to my Tdarr server, and then paste it in here. Now what that would do once I paste it in here, it will basically create the flow that sits here, and it'd be called an AV1 Plex guide, and that will sit there. We're almost there now. Now, once that's done, all I need to do is to make sure that when I'm doing my libraries, so if I take my media library itself, I need to make sure from a transcode option point that it's not using a classic plugin stack, but actually using the flow. So all I need to do is within the particular library setup, so you'll do one of these for movies, you do one for TV, you might do it for music videos, that kind of thing, or your YouTube videos. You would just come in here, untick classic plugin stack, and you do that by just clicking flow. And then all you finally need to do is basically click on the drop down box, and any flows that you've added in there, I'm sure there are other developers out there putting these together. You should just be able to click on there and it will absolutely do everything you want it to do. Now, what happens then is you will find that your node, and this is my example one, will be spinning away and doing these transcodes. And you can see at the moment I've got 4 concurrently running. I have blurred the names out, even though they are legally attained movies. I still don't want to get in trouble because you just never know. But they're all basically sitting and running in that background there. And some of them will take time. This is because all of these are 4K files, so it will take a little bit longer. But when I do this with 1080p files, for example, I'll be honest, this transcodes in probably around 5 minutes. And like with TV programs, for example, you can take a 2 gig file down to a 330 meg in a few minutes, which is quite a space saving if you've got a whole TV series that you've ripped from Blu-ray up to your hard drive to use with such services as Plex or Jellyfin. So I said I would show you how this is done within Unraid. And I'm quite a new Unraid adopter, so if I have configured this wrong, please, by all means, call me out on it. Tell me I'm doing something particularly wrong. But basically, my array sits here and does various things and basically is pulling away at the moment. You can see down here at the moment, my system is basically running and I've got a plugin which is giving me GPU statistics. And what that's enabled me to do on this scenario is basically prove that this Intel Arc is actually the one doing the transcoding. So this is all that's running on my system at the moment. I've got no media being shared. At the moment, there's nothing being streamed from my Plex server. I've recently had to rebuild this because I've had a few dramas, unfortunately, when it comes to Unraid. But that's part of the learning curve. But what's happening in the bottom here, I can see my GPU is basically being used. I can see that it's the Intel Arc A380 being used, and I can see the current video load up there at the moment, and what app is running it. And you can clearly see at the bottom, it is Tdarr that's running it at present. So absolutely, that's what goes ahead. Now, when Plex is running, for example, what would happen is you would see something very different. You would be seeing in here my Plex server, basically utilizing GPU1, which is the Intel iGPU. So how does this work? From the perspective of actually configuring it, I will show you. So we need to add a couple of applications to begin with. And those applications, if I just look at installed apps, and I focus on two particular ones. One is the GPU statistics. You will need this. You'll need to point this out. It's more of a tertiary thing that's useful for you to basically pull that information through so that you can see and confirm that you're actually using the right GPU when doing this, because most people will use something like an Intel. If you're using a Xeon, obviously you're not likely to, or you won't have an iGPU, so it's not something to be worry about. But if you're using that, or even if you're using a Ryzen, for example, with a APU on, you will be able to see if what you're using. Intels are particularly good because obviously they've got that quick sync feature, and they can, in most cases with generational leaps, encode into or transcode into AV1. So that's really, really cool. The other two that you'll need is basically to add in these two. So in my scenario, I've added Intel GPU top, which is one key for utilizing the internal version of your GPU. But also add in the following as well, which is Intel GVT-G, which is something else we need to make sure that we're using. You'll notice my Unraid version is 7.01. Now you will need to be on Unraid 7 at the very latest, or the very minimum, to actually have this feature, because basically the kernel drivers for Intel are, or the very minimum, to actually have this feature, because basically the kernel drivers for Intel Arc cards was only released in version 7. So if you're running 6.8, you will need to upgrade. So just bear that in mind. Now, how I've got this set up within my Docker stack is, if I look at Tdarr, I'll just open it so you can get a bit of a feel. I've done this very similar. So normally what I would do is not have an internal node. I would have that false and then spin up a separate node and run it that way. But further down at the bottom, basically I'm referencing render D129. Now the difference is with this one is, you can remember on the other one that I was doing, I was referencing D128. The difference is here that I have two, because I've passed through my iGPU, which is render D129 or 28. I'm now having to utilize D129. So it's just something to bear in mind, that you need to make sure which one you're running. One of the easiest ways to do it is to use that GPU statistics thing. If you're using this in Unraid, it's really simple to look at. Another way is if you're using something like Plex or Jellyfin, once you do the same process for passing through, is actually look when it goes into the hardware transcoder what it's actually seeing, because what it will be able to do in the likes of Plex, for example, when you look at hardware transcoding, is actually tell you what device it's using. Now, if it's using something like an older Lake, that will be your iGPU. If you're referencing something like an Intel card or an NVIDIA card, obviously you're going to see that NVENC or the Intel Arc appearing for that scenario. But there we are, that is Tdarr. I will follow up shortly with the kind of output from what happened with mine running for several hours, basically going through the very recent media library that I've re-ripped onto my system, just to show you the actual savings on just the array that I've set up again very, very recently. So there we are. That is how to configure Tdarr or Tdarr, whichever way, whichever floats your boat, really. Now, the great thing is, obviously, you can use Tdarr to re-encode your videos to meet a smaller footprint that you can basically then reuse and store on your NAS storage. And like me, if you're making a lot of content videos, this is really beneficial, because basically you're reducing the amount of footprint that you're using across your NASs or your other storage devices that you're using, and you'll be able to compress them. Now, there are some downsides of AV1. The purists will say, obviously, you're compressing raw footage, so therefore you're not going to get as much quality, and that is fine, absolutely. To the naked eye, you do very well to notice the difference. A lot of the times now, even YouTube videos are re-encoded in AV1 when they're uploaded. Mine certainly are. And if you can notice the difference in quality from a video perspective from one to the other, well done you. To be honest, until we see the introduction of the likes of 8K screens, in a more mainstream scenario, I really don't see that anybody's going to notice a difference. I mean, let's be honest, people still stream and create content in 1080p. So, you know, you kind of each their own, really. Now, the good thing is about AV1 is obviously it will reduce stuff to a smaller footprint. There are some downsides, though, and mainly that is around device support. So not every single device you have at home will necessarily support AV1 out the box. So if you've got something like a Plex server that you're hosting your legal obtained media on, then reality is you may still need to transcode. And that's where the, you know, your device, whether it's your quick sync or your actual GPU, will come into play as well. But anyway, what I wanted to do is cover off a nice automated solution. Obviously, being Tdarr, it kind of sits into the R version of services. I'm sure you understand what I mean, my hearties. But the reality is that it's a really useful tool to actually just even monitor and watch your folders and basically reduce the file storage size and recompress those video content for long-term storage needs, because you never know when you may need to flash back to an old video. Anyway, if you have liked this video, then please hit the like and subscribe. And as always, I will see you next time.